I really feel like history is the sort of mother of all humanistic disciplines. Now, apologies to any of my colleagues in the other humanities and social sciences who may see this, but everything that we do comes from somewhere, and history is about how it got to be the way it is. And I find myself just constantly curious about the world around me and how it got to be the way it is. I think that history gives us a grasp of the big questions. You know, how do societies work? How do changes take place on a big scale? We can look at history through economic data. We can look at it through demography. We can look at now, of course, a lot of climate history. You know, there are lots and lots of ways in which we really apply a kind of rigorous, large-scale analysis to data in history. At the same time, history is for me a very humanistic pursuit because my own passion in history is thinking about the people who made it, the people who lived it. And history allows us to drill down on those individual experiences and tell their stories. And I have been really influenced in my own work by fiction and by narrative storytelling as practiced by people in a whole range of genres. And I also learned from my own undergraduate education, which bridged history and literature, about the importance and the value of close reading of our sources, whether they be visual or written or otherwise. And so that's a piece of the historical pursuit that I also really like. I first came to the topic of Joseph Conrad on a kind of whim because it occurred to me in my studies of the history of the British Empire that the image of the British Empire at its height is so often one that we conjure up through the work of an author like Rudyard Kipling, specifically Rudyard Kipling, who is the author of poems including The White Man's Burden. And then I remembered that there was another author that I had read in school who gave quite different pictures of the world at much the same time as Kipling, and that was Joseph Conrad, who, among other things, in his novella Heart of Darkness, offered a really powerful critique of the European civilizing mission of the times. And so I thought to myself, what would the British Empire look like if we took Conrad as its archetypal author instead of Kipling? And that was what got me into the project. What I found as I researched it was that the world that Conrad lived in and described was a world that was shaped in part by the British Empire, but was also shaped by many other empires and was characterized by all kinds of phenomena and forces that were going on in his lifetime that are what we would today, in retrospect, call globalization. Changes in technology, changes in transport, the spread of people and ideas across borders on a scale and over a range that had never before been seen. So that was my engagement with Conrad, and I found myself only almost later then having to kind of rethink a variety of questions about Conrad's own positionality in the post-colonial landscape. Of course, I was aware that he was a controversial figure, but I always took for granted that he was a controversial figure. Of course he was racist. Of course he was all these things. And of course, in post-colonial studies, we understand that this is who Conrad is. And so I was a little surprised, I guess, to find that there's a feeling that if you write about a person like Conrad, then it means that you're endorsing everything they're doing. And so I hope that what I've managed to produce in the book is a treatment of someone who I think is really interesting, but is not necessarily somebody that would be like my best friend, you know, or the person that I would vote for in an election or something like that. But I think he has a lot to say to us, and I found my time with him, if not always comfortable and if not always easy, definitely always interesting. So one of the things that I do in my research is I try to visit everywhere that I write about. And in the case of Conrad, that meant taking a few long voyages to places that are not typically on researchers' routes these days. One of them was to get on the ocean, because Conrad spent 20 years of his life as a working sailor. And it's a piece of this planet, the ocean, that until a generation or two ago, anyone who traveled between continents was most likely to have some experience with, but now has really vanished from most of our consciousness. And yet, more goods travel by sea today than at any time in world history. Something like 90% of world trade goes by sea. So what I did in my effort to get a feel for the maritime environment that Conrad himself knew was to get on board a container ship, which is the equivalent of the cargo ships that Conrad sailed from Britain to Australia carrying wool, for example. And it was an incredible voyage because it did suddenly make me see this earth and this ocean in a very different way. And it also gave me insight, I think, into elements of Conrad's own storytelling, the way that he is incredibly sensitive, for example, to the environment and atmosphere is something that suddenly made sense to me when I was on board a ship and realized that that's what you are constantly engaging with when you're at sea. The way that he deals with time and narrative voice, which is famously in Conrad really innovative in the way that he breaks up chronology and inserts other narratives. And that made sense to me as well on board a ship where you have this group of people who are cut off from other sources of information from the land and are all there together and are telling stories and are looking back to their earlier adventures and looking ahead to when they will hit a home port. I started my book thinking that I was going to say something about the British Empire, and I hope I say something about the British Empire, but what I hope I say about the British Empire is that the British Empire is sitting in a world of other empires. Britain is sitting within Europe, a context which has been, I think, somewhat downplayed in relation to the well-known quote-unquote imperial turn in British studies, of which I have very much been a part. So I wanted to reintroduce Europe into the story. And I also found, as I have already described, that my story of the British Empire was ultimately a story also of this moment of a step change in globalization, as we would now call it. Globalization is a word that is used a lot these days and is politically charged and has a whole set of connotations and values associated with it, which I myself feel very conflicted about, I should say. I am, for example, one of many people, I think, who find myself very supportive of freedom of movement and immigrants' rights and freedom of access. I'm very, very aware of what I mentioned with respect to my trip to Congo, the accidents of birth that mean that I have a passport that just automatically gives me power in the world economy. And yet I am also aware that globalization can have some really challenging effects for people. It has clearly enhanced forms of global inequality. It has clearly resulted in very significant global shifts in things like manufacturing, which have left a lot of what we would call globalization losers in Western Europe and the United States, for example, and a progressive politics that seeks to address the interests of these people is one that I'm also very sympathetic to. This is me. There are other people who would have other positions, but my point in it is to say that globalization is a very rich and complicated process, but it's one we have seen before. And I think that because the term is relatively new and because it is of such present importance and relevance in politics right now in the 21st century, we sometimes lose sight of the earlier histories of globalization, good or bad or in between or whatever. And what I hope that my book does is contribute a chapter to what we would consider to be a sort of cultural, social history of globalization that gives us some insight into how people in an earlier generation wrestled with exactly the kinds of challenges and competing goods and bads and agendas that we're dealing with today. So it's significant to me first and foremost because it's a history prize. And there's a lot of nonfiction prizes out there which are rewarding writing across a whole bunch of genres and which often will look at books that deal with the world today. History is sometimes a part of that, but it's in the mix with a whole bunch of other genres. And then there's a bunch of history prizes which tend to be academic history prizes geared toward subspecialties within the profession. But the Cundill Prize is really remarkable because it is a nonfiction prize for history. And that leads me to the second thing that I'm really excited about, which is that it's a prize that recognizes the literary merit of history writing. And as I've said in the course of this interview, you know, for me, the writing of this book and the writing of history through a literary figure was so much engaged in questions of narrative and how we tell a story, that to be recognized for telling the story by my colleagues in history is a really wonderful feeling. So I'm really grateful to everyone involved in it, to Peter Cundill for recognizing that history is something that we need to recognize as a literary art and that we need to recognize among nonfiction genres. And it's terrific to be here.